Hi everyone! Today's video is going to be my palette favorites for 2018, and this is going to cover pretty much any palette that I've really fallen in love with in the last year. They're not necessarily new for 2018, they're just ones that I have really enjoyed throughout 2018. I'm going to kick this off by talking about my Too Faced palette favorites throughout the year because I've definitely got more of those than I do of any other brand. And the first one that really surprised me at the start of 2018 was the Too Faced White Chocolate Bar palette. I don't even remember what I said in my video review because it was probably about a year ago, but I remember thinking that this was overall very pale, and I found I had to sort of change my mentality of how to work with this palette when I first got it. In essence, I don't feel like this palette really works on its own because everything is so pale in here, but what I did find is that there's so many lid colors and transition colors in this palette that I found it very helpful to use in conjunction with other palettes. I did find the pigmentation to be a little bit wishy-washy in terms of some colors, and that's mostly to do with the ones that are a little bit deeper. Smoked sea salt and chocolate syrup over here are not great at best, but the rest of the palette really works well on the lid. Exotica, Indulge, and Sugared Raisin, I use those constantly on my lid. They are so much fun if you pair them with deeper palettes that have a bit more like depth that you can put in the outer corner, because that's something that I really appreciate. But yeah, the White Chocolate Bar palette was out for such a brief period of time. Very few people got their hands on it, and most people did not like it at all. But for me, I found when I kind of changed how I thought about this palette and used it with other palettes, I ended up loving it. And I actually brought this with me to LA in January, and I never got tired of it. I mean, I meshed it with other palettes so that it would work for me, but I was really pleased with this one. Around the same time that Too Faced put out the White Chocolate Bar palette, they also launched the Chocolate Gold palette. Now, both of these launched in, I think, late 2017, but they were out within roughly the same time frame. Now, this I think was more widely received by people as being a good palette, and it is a stunner. This is such a knockout palette. Everything in here is super pigmented, buttery, smooth, very foiled in texture when you wear these on the lids. And this palette actually, much like the White Chocolate Bar palette, works for me a lot when I'm using these as lid shades. There's very limited like matte shades in here. You've really only got a brown, a mid-tone sort of brown shade, a cream, and a black. Those shades do actually work very, very well with the rest of the colors in here, but I would have appreciated like a matte dark purple or something like that in there. That being said, I don't want to talk about the negatives because I actually do really love this palette. I have gone back to this thing time and time again just for something on the lid. And you might notice that it looks like I've hit Pan and Love and Cocoa. That did not happen. I dropped the palette and that shade shattered everywhere. The shades in here are very rich and deep and really, they're jewel tones basically, and I find that can be kind of different for Too Faced because they tend to like skirt the line of like more mid-tone with a lot of pink in their stuff. This is definitely a bit more bejeweled and rich, and I thoroughly loved this palette in the last year. In fact, I pulled this palette back out more recently just because it's fall time. I wanted to use deeper colors, and I've been using this a lot with the next palette, which is the Too Faced Gingerbread Spice palette. Now, obviously, this is a newer release for Too Faced, but I can assure you that I love this one so much. When I first saw it previewed online, I got so excited. The colors in here are right up my alley. I tend to refer to this palette as the neutral palette for color lovers because there's a lot of neutral shades in here, but I feel like there's more color overall. And I think most people who wear a lot of neutrals look at me and think that I'm crazy because this is obviously a very colorful palette. But as somebody who wears a lot of vibrant, bright colors, I don't want a plain neutral and nude palette that's just gonna be a whole range of browns. That's not enticing to me. So something like this, with a lot more of like the reds and the oranges and a ton of browns, it has to be said, is what I'm looking for in a neutral palette. So you've got a whole bunch of like more muted jewel tones over on this side. This gold, oh, it's stunning. And the Gumdrop shade up here, so beautiful. Spice is nice. I mean, there is not a bad shade in this palette. Every time I have used this, I've been so in love with the eye looks that I've created. And I've been using it in connection with the Chocolate Gold palette just because there's so many lid colors in here that work really well with the more matte transition colors in here, because this palette is about 50-50 in terms of mattes and shimmers versus the Chocolate Gold has really only 4 mattes. So this works out really well with that palette, and honestly, I mean, you can't go wrong using this palette on its own. but I find I like to use as much of my makeup as I possibly can, so I like to combine palettes together, and I've just been really pleased with using the Gingerbread Spice palette with the Chocolate Gold palette. That being said, this palette on its own is an absolute knockout. Every shade is so special and so perfect in here, and it's the kind of palette that makes me really excited to wear it over Christmas, just because, I mean, the theme is so freaking cute. I love the colors in here, and the quality is top notch. There's no bad shades in here in terms of pigmentation, and I really do love every single color in here. The next favorite Too Faced palette for 2018 is one that I have mentioned time and time again. I feel like I bust this out every single year, so it's been a continual favorite for quite a long time. It's the Sweet Peach palette. This thing is just wonderful, and I don't get tired of it. Every spring and summer I pull this out and I am so excited to use it. And yeah, there's a lot of brown in here, but it has to be pointed out that there's a decent chunk of purple over on this side, and the warm tones in here have a little bit more orange to them, which is what I like in my neutral colors. The shades that definitely entice me the most in this palette would be Candied Peach up here, which is just a gorgeous neon peach color, and then Luscious down here, so beautiful. That on the lid with a Candied Peach on the outer corner and like one of these darker shades to deepen it up. One of my absolute favorite colors that I go back to every single time that I wear this palette. And I mean, the scent is half of the enticement factor too. The Sweet Peach scent is definitely my favorite scent that Too Faced does. I'm not as big of a fan as the Peaches and Cream scent. For me, it's more based on the Sweet Peach scent. So I want to see them release more in this kind of scent range, and they did come out with that mini one for the holidays, but like, I want even more. So yeah, the Sweet Peach is an annual favorite of mine. Love it so much. All right, the last Too Faced palette I'm going to talk about is probably no surprise, but it's the Life's a Festival palette. I think this was such a good release for the brand. It came out, when was it? I mean, it must have been for spring or summer 2018, but it probably came out in March. I was so excited when I saw this palette. It's a beautiful rainbow of colors, and every single one of them works well together. I had originally thought that there was way too much shimmer in this palette and that they wouldn't potentially work very well on the lid because there was just not enough mattes to balance it out. Totally take that back. I don't believe that at all now. I have used only shimmers on my lids with this palette, and somehow it just works. There's something so special and unique about this palette that I just want everybody to kind of own it, just so that they can play around with the colors in here. Because while I feel like the colors are exciting and vibrant and, you know, really enticing, I also think that there's something uniquely wearable about the colors in here. I've pointed out many times before in videos that the colors over on this side of the palette tend to be what people will gravitate towards if they're looking at something a little bit more colorful. But if you blend these shades with anything over here, you can get almost like a rainbow look without going like too intense or too deep. And it's mostly because the shades tend to fall in the softer sort of pale to mid-tone range. The only shade that I would say is potentially quite deep is a Fantasy over here, but you have to build that up because it is a purple in order to get it to look really deep. Artist Pass down here is that typical kind of blue-brown pigment you tend to see a lot that MAC made famous years and years ago. But even though it looks quite deep in the pan, on the lid it's not that bright because it is a duochromatic shade that reflects light at different angles, and it tends to look more reflective than it does deep. I did hear a few people complaining about this packaging, and honestly, whatever. I mean, packaging is very subjective. I think it's kind of cute and unique, and it is surprisingly compact given that it's shaped bizarrely, and honestly it fits well in my bookcase where I keep all my palettes. This palette was just an absolute knockout for this year. I loved it so much that I gave it away during my blog's 5th anniversary giveaway back in October because I wanted somebody else to own it too. So huge hit for Too Faced as far as I'm concerned. Alright, moving on to other brands. One of the palettes that I got to know super well at the beginning of this year was the Violet Voss Hashtag palette. And wow, what a knockout palette this is. The shades in here are the epitome of that most beautiful sunset that you have ever seen in your entire life. The oranges and the purples and the golds are just flawless. I really can't think of another word to use for this palette that encompasses how I feel about the whole thing other than flawless, because this thing is truly an absolute treasure in a palette. Now there's a ton of shimmery colors in here, but there's also a decent chunk of mattes. This entire top row is all mattes, and they will help you kind of make any of these shades a little bit deeper or kind of ground them as well. But for me, the heart of this palette really falls to these shimmery colors because they are just stunning. They are so freaking pretty. And whenever I use this palette, I felt like I kept making a sunset eye look, but it always had slightly different coloring every time I used it. And honestly, it just made me smile. I think this is one of the best palettes that I've tried in the last year. I mean, I know that this video is about like my favorites of 2018, but this one really brought like a huge smile to my face every time I used it. And I know I've even pointed out that a lot of these colors in here can be quite similar. I feel like Fresh and Sauce are close to each other. Goals and Savage are pretty similar as well. And even Low Key and Living look quite similar in the pan. And yes, that's kind of true when you put them on the eyes, but I also feel like slight tonal differences in the same shade can actually create a lot of dimension in your eye look. So I ended up layering Savage and Goals all the time. I use these two gold orange colors together as well. So yeah, they look fundamentally quite similar in the pan, but in practice, I just found that they added a little bit more of just that perfect blend when you're trying to get a good eyeshadow look and you discover that using one color isn't enough. If you add another one in, usually they're gonna fade out nicer. And that's what I found happened a lot with this palette. Even when I thought the colors were a little bit too similar, I just felt that they worked well together to get a smoother blend. So this palette is like perfect as far as I'm concerned. I really think that this is such a stunning palette. This palette is also permanent, which is great because not everything I'm mentioning in this video is permanent. There is a chunk of limited edition stuff in here, but this one's permanent so you can get your hands on it. The next palette is actually a face palette that I picked up at IMATS 2017 in New York, I think it was, and I gave it a crummy review on my blog just because I felt like the colors didn't really work out that well for me. Well, I don't know what happened in 2018, but I'm suddenly in love with the Anastasia Beverly Hills Aurora Glow Kit. When I initially got this, I thought the colors were just strange. I didn't feel that they were that appealing on my face, and I just didn't like it. So I don't know what's happened this year. Maybe I'm just wearing different colors on my eyes and the highlighter shades in here mesh better than what I was wearing in 2017, but I am reaching for this all the time now. I had initially thought that Spectra was too bizarre of a highlighter shade to wear, and I still kind of agree with that, but I'm wearing it anyway. It's kind of a purple gray mix. I mean, it must be pointed out that it's not the most flattering of shades, but holy heck is it ever unique. I love Lyra and I love Eclipse. I wear those ones all the time. And in fact, Lyra was the only shade that I thought was pretty when I initially picked up this palette. I've been wearing Helia a lot too. What a cool, like green yellow color. I mean, I wear these as like unique highlighters on my face, and I know not everybody's into the colorful highlighters, but that trend never died for me, so I'm still wearing those shades. Yeah, so overall, hated this palette when I first got it, pretty much ignored it, and I swear I almost decluttered it at one point, but now this has been like in rotation in my collection on a weekly basis, I would say. At least bi-weekly, but probably closer to weekly. I reach for this guy all the time. Another newer favorite would be the Suva Beauty Saffron palette. Oh, I just put up a video not that long ago with like my normal palette review. So there's 5 looks, swatches, etc. And I couldn't say enough good things about this palette. It is wonderful. The colors in here are so special and so unique. I love the reds in here. I'm so happy to see like more than one red thrown into a palette, because usually a brand will throw one red into there and call it a day. I'm thinking about the Anastasia Beverly Hills palette that just came out. It was like all neutrals and then one red shade. It was bizarre. Anyway, this one works out really, really well together, and I've talked about it a lot recently, so I don't want to reiterate too much, but I feel like the colors are perfect. There's not one in here that stands out as being a dud, and I truly feel like you can take any 2 colors or any 3 colors in this palette, put them together in a look, and it will be flawless. I did not have a single problem with this palette, and in fact, every time I used it, I had a smile on my face. I was just so happy to see a 9-pan palette, which for me tends to be quite small. I tend to like my larger palettes, so when I see a 9-pan, I tend to think, oh, there's not enough in there. There totally is with this one, and there's just something fantastic about each and every single shade in here that it's such a perfect cohesive palette for me, and yet it only has 9 shades. So I think that makes it really special. And I know not enough people are aware of Suva Beauty, but they are a Canadian brand and they're out of, I think it's Vancouver. So if you're curious in checking them out, definitely go ahead because I feel like the quality, particularly on this palette, is flawless. The next palette I'm going to talk about is one that I mostly love for the top 2 rows, although the whole thing is good. But the palette that I'm talking about is the Julius Masquerade mini palette. They do make a larger version of this, but I don't need that much more eyeshadow in my life, so I have the mini version. And I gravitate towards the top 2 rows because they are that kind of cool toned bright eye look that I like to put together all the time. I love putting like a green on the lid with a purple in the outer corner and then putting a blue in between it to make this gorgeous transition color. So I did that a lot with this palette, as well as putting this kind of bright pink in the upper crease area to add it as a transition shade, which fundamentally I don't love pink. I think it's too much of a girly girl color as far as I'm concerned. But in a hot pink color and using that in the crease, it can be a really gorgeous transition color. So I've kind of learned to love pink when I'm using it that way. So the top 2 rows are really what pull me towards this palette. The quality is good on the bottom 2, but I feel like the shades down here are very disjointed from the top. I mean, it's nice to have all these colors available in one palette, but I definitely don't use the bottom 2 rows that much. I stick to the upper half. The thing that really gets me about Julius is that their price point is very, very low, and yet the quality is really good. I'm often concerned when I pick up products that are drugstore priced because drugstore eyeshadow can be really hit and miss. Like, there's not a lot of brands out there that I would say produce good quality drugstore eyeshadows. And yet Julius produces excellent quality at drugstore prices, and they're almost always having a sale too. So if you've been curious about Julius, they make a lot of different palettes. They have plenty of neutral ones, plenty of colorful ones, but I'd encourage you to check it out because the quality is really good and the price is not that high. And on the note of drugstore palettes, there is one brand that I feel actually succeeds at doing a good quality eyeshadows pretty much every time they put out a release, and that's Wet n Wild. And these are 2 palettes that I've definitely been using the most throughout 2018, but it does need to be said that almost all of their eyeshadow launches are flawless. So if you like the palette that you're looking at the drugstore, just pick it up because they're super cheap and they're actually really good quality. So the one that I've been using a ton this past year is the Rose in the Air palette, and we all know that this is a dupe at this point for the ABH Modern Renaissance palette. I think this one is missing 4 shades, maybe 2 in comparison to that palette, but you can get pretty much any single look out of this palette that you could out of the ABH one. I do feel like the shades are potentially a little bit not as soft as the ABH ones, but they still blend out as nicely. They are beautiful on the eyes. Nothing wrong with this palette at all, and I think it's like $5. $5. The other one I've been loving is the Not a Basic Peach palette. And this one is more on that sort of neutral, warm, orange gold side of things. There is one pop of blue in here, but the bulk of this palette is pretty much orange with gold. And just like the Rose and the Air palette, these shadows are soft and smooth and pigmented, and these palettes both have a ton of matte colors in here, which is super important, and that used to be kind of a pain point for Wet n Wild. I mean, not recently, but like years ago, they used to have a lot of shimmery colors in their palettes and not enough mattes. That's no longer a problem. They put out plenty of mattes now, and the shimmers work so well with the mattes, and the quality is always good. I'm always really happy with my Wet n Wild palettes. Another more recent favorite, or I guess at least for the second half of 2018, is Fenty Beauty's Moroccan Spice palette. I've mentioned before that I'm actually mad that I got this in PR because I wish I hadn't waited to get it in PR and I had just bought it as soon as it got launched, because this is so good. It's got the red in there, which I always appreciate in a palette, but it's got a ton of mattes that help that red out as well. And the gold row up here, which all looks very, very similar when you're just looking at it on camera or even in pictures, is actually very different in practice. I took this palette with me to New York City, I think it was, in October. Loved every minute of it. I was so happy to just be using one palette over and over again and discovering new ways to wear it. I fell madly in love with this palette as soon as I used it. I did put out a full review video, which if I have a review for any of these palettes, I'll link to them down below. But this one surprised me so much. I just thought that this was going to be yet another mostly neutral palette with a pop of blue, but it really surprised me. So I hadn't initially picked this up as soon as it launched because I think Fenty's other launches had been very shimmery, like all shimmer eyeshadow palettes, and I was just like, I don't need that. I don't need something that's just shimmer. So I kind of waited on this one, and then I got it in PR and I was like, I shouldn't have waited. I should have picked this up as soon as it launched. And I don't actually think that this is limited edition either. I had thought it was because I thought it was part of their summer launch, but I think it's a permanent product, which makes me really, really happy. The only thing that I think is weird is that the outer packaging is gorgeous, but looks nothing like what's on the inside of this palette. It just seems like a weird sort of mashup. Anyway, I highly recommend this palette. I wish I hadn't slept on it. I mean, I have it now and I'm using it and loving it, but if you've been thinking about this one, definitely go get it. Okay, we're almost there. There's 2 palettes left to talk about. The next one I'm gonna be mentioning is the Kat Von D 10th Anniversary palette. Now, I've already discussed a few times how I feel about the whole Kat Von D vaccination thing. I'm not in support of it, but this did launch before that vaccination nonsense came out, so I did pick it up. And I have to say, it's a really good launch. I was really happy to see this palette from her because I feel like a lot of people missed out on the Mi Vida Loca remix palette from, what was that, 2015, something like that? And this is basically a more mature version of that palette. I think the shades in here are really just Mi Vida Loca remix grown up. They're a little bit more understated, not as vibrant, but they're so much fun to use. I like that there's a ton of mattes in here that are mattes that I tend to want to wear, like this blue and this deeper teal and the red. I like putting those kind of colors in the outer corner, so when I see those kinds of mattes in a palette like this, I'm really happy to see them. And for those of you who do own Mi Vida Loca Remix, this works really well with that palette just because you're getting more variety to put with that rainbow mix. So I was happy to see another rainbow palette by Kat Von D because I feel like she releases a lot of palettes that are beautiful color stories, but I really like rainbow palettes, so I wanted to see a new rainbow palette by her, and I definitely got my wish with this one. And the very last palette I'm going to mention is one that probably I don't think I've really talked about much this year, but it was a really good one, even though it's in such awkward packaging. So this is Tarte's Be a Mermaid and Make Waves palette, and I find the palette packaging really cumbersome. Albeit pretty and cute, but quite cumbersome because it's not flat either. Like, it's rounded on the edges, which makes it very difficult to store. So this clamshell palette is very neutral overall. Someone pointed out that if you just hide the bottom 2 shades, you're looking at a warm neutral palette. And that's true, but I actually really like how the colors in here work with those more red toned neutral palettes. And the thing that I think makes me really love this palette the most is this Bubbles shade down here. This is like a blue purple duochrome, and I have owned nothing like it before. Because of the duochrome nature of that shade, it actually works out so well with any of these sort of red warm shades that kind of fill in the rest of the palette over here. It's not something I would ever think to do because it does look fundamentally quite blue in the pan, but that underlayer of the sort of red tone to it works out so well with the other colors in this palette. So I didn't talk about this one much, and I'm not really sure why, but it's been a definite favorite throughout the year. I just wish that the packaging was a little bit easier to store. And it's funny because, like I said, that the Too Faced Life's a Festival one is weird shaped but fine to store, and it's purely because that one is flat and this one has a curvature to it. So I basically just sit it upright like this, but it's at risk of falling all the time. Okay, so that is my palette favorites for 2018. I didn't think that there was going to be that many to talk about when I first started putting this video together, but I do really love my eyeshadow palettes. Let me know what your favorites were throughout the year, and I will talk to you next time. Bye!